The town of Dust Creek was the kind of place where people were worth as much as the work their hands could offer. If you could swing a pick, herd cattle, or stand behind a saloon counter from dusk till dawn, you had value. If not, well, the prairie winds would scatter you like dry tumbleweed. That was what happened to Evelyn Hart, a woman no older than 24, whose lungs had betrayed her long before her spirit ever did. She came into town one summer, thin as a rail, her cough echoing through the streets like the rattle of an old wagon wheel. The settlers looked at her and whispered, "Too sick to work, not worth a meal, not worth the trouble." Evelyn had been raised in a mining camp where her father died under a mountain collapse and her mother worked herself into the grave scrubbing laundry in creek water cold enough to freeze bone. By the time Evelyn stumbled into Dust Creek, she had nothing but a frayed shawl, a satchel with a broken strap, and a determination that refused to let her collapse on the roadside. She knocked on doors for housework, offered to teach children their letters, even tried the saloon for dishwashing, but her coughing fit would drive the keepers to slam doors in her face. Each rejection pushed her closer to the edge of town, closer to the place where folks who didn't matter were forgotten. But the prairie has its way of crossing paths between the forsaken and the unlikely. On a day when her body felt weaker than it ever had, Evelyn found herself slumped against the hitching post outside the general store, her breath shallow, her eyes blurred with fever. That was when Colt McAllister, a cowboy with sunburned skin, quiet eyes, and a way of speaking less than he listened, reined in his horse. He watched her, not with the look of disdain the others gave, but with something she hadn't seen in years: concern. Dust rose between them as the wind carried a voice from the crowd. "She's too sick to work, Colt. Don't waste your time." But instead of riding on, he dismounted, knelt beside her, and in a voice steady as the plains said, "If they won't call you worth keeping, maybe it's time somebody called you mine."
The dusty air of Dry Creek had never been heavier than it was that afternoon when Colt stepped forward. His boots struck the wooden planks of the boarding house porch like gunshots, each step ringing against the silence that had swallowed the crowd. Men had stopped mid-conversation. Women clutched shawls tighter around their shoulders. Children, too young to understand, stared wide-eyed at the tall figure standing beside the frail woman everyone else had already written off. Evelyn's thin shoulders trembled, her face pale beneath the harsh sun, but she didn't lower her gaze. She kept her chin lifted, even as whispers darted like arrows through the gathering. "Too sick to work," someone muttered near the saloon doors. "A burden, nothing more." "She won't last the winter," another replied, the words sharp as the desert wind. "Then why's he standing there with her?" Colt heard every word, but he didn't flinch. He let the brim of his hat shadow his eyes as he placed one broad, calloused hand lightly on Evelyn's arm, not possessive, not pitying, but steady, like a man anchoring a ship against a rising tide. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the murmurs like the crack of a whip. "She's not a burden. She's my wife." The words hung in the air. No gunshot, no thunderclap could have struck harder. For a heartbeat, the whole of Dry Creek stood frozen, staring at the cowboy whose reputation for silence was nearly as wide as the plains themselves. Colt McGraw didn't waste words. Folks knew him as the man who worked sun up to sundown without complaint, who rode alone across miles of empty land, who drank his whiskey without ever raising his voice. But now his voice carried fire, conviction, and something more dangerous than both: defiance. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. Wife. He had called her his wife in front of every soul in town. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She could only stare at him, at the unshakable line of his jaw, the way he stood like a wall between her and the contempt of the crowd. Her hands, frail as bird bones, clutched the fabric of her dress, torn and faded at the hem. She felt her heart stumble in her chest, unsure whether to break or to race. Then came the laughter. Harsh, bitter, cruel. Old man Whitlock from the general store spat a wad of tobacco into the dirt and shook his head. "Your wife?" he sneered. "Hell, McGraw, you must have baked your brain out under that sun. She can't even walk a full mile without coughing blood." "Better men have buried wives younger than her," another voice cheered. "Maybe he just wants cheap labor. Ain't no preacher gonna bless a sick girl into a home. Or maybe he's lost his damn mind." Colt turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping across them like the barrel of a loaded gun. No words, just silence. The kind that made men shuffle their boots and glance at one another, unsure whether to laugh harder or hold their tongues. Finally, his eyes settled on Whitlock. "You think I need your blessing? You think I need a preacher's? A man don't need permission to stand beside a woman." It wasn't just a declaration, it was a challenge. Evelyn felt the air around her shift, the weight of the crowd pressing in like wolves circling prey, and yet with Colt standing so near, she didn't feel the bite of their teeth. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something she had almost forgotten: safety. Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him to stop, that he was ruining himself by tying his name to hers. She wanted to whisper that he didn't owe her anything. But her body betrayed her. No sound would leave her lips. Instead, tears stung her eyes, and she quickly blinked them back, unwilling to let the town see her weep. "Colt," she managed finally, her voice a trembling whisper, "you don't have to do this." His hand tightened gently on her arm. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the crowd, on the men who had called her worthless, on the women who pitied her from a safe distance. "I already did."
The murmurs swelled again, some angry, some mocking, some curious. But in every pair of eyes that followed them, Evelyn saw disbelief. They would not accept it. They would not let her belong. And yet, Colt seemed to know this, and still he stood firm. Sheriff Alden, a barrel-chested man with a silver star dulled by dust, pushed through the onlookers. His brow was furrowed deep, his hat tipped low. "McGraw," he said, voice carrying authority, "you can't just declare something like that in the street. Marriage is a covenant. Takes a preacher, witnesses. You know that." Colt's expression didn't change. "Then let this town be my witness." He spread his free hand, palm open to the gawking faces. "Every last one of you heard me. Evelyn May is my wife." The sheriff scratched his jaw, uneasy. "You're making a mistake, son." Colt's reply was quiet but firm. "It's mine to make." With that, he guided Evelyn down the steps of the boarding house porch. The crowd parted like wheat before the scythe, mutters following in their wake, some sharp with judgment, others softened by reluctant respect. Evelyn felt every eye on her fragile frame, but none of it mattered as much as the steady rhythm of Colt's stride beside her. When they reached his horse, a tall bay with muscles rippling beneath its hide, Colt lifted her with ease. For a moment, she clutched his shoulders, her body trembling against his strength. Their eyes met, hers wide with confusion, his steady, unwavering. She wanted to speak, to demand why he had done this, but her voice tangled with the pounding of her heart. The reins jingled as Colt swung into the saddle behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to hold her steady. He tugged the reins, and the bay started forward, hooves drumming against the hard-packed dirt as the town slowly shrank behind them. Only when the buildings blurred into the horizon did Evelyn find her voice again. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you call me that?" Colt's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed ahead on the empty road. "Because they'd have thrown you away otherwise, and I don't throw people away." His words were simple, but they struck her deeper than any poetry could. For so long she had been discarded, overlooked, whispered about as if she were already in the grave. And here was a man, a quiet cowboy who barely spoke two words when one would do,
given her the only name that could shield her from the cruelty of the town, wife. Her chest ached with something she hadn't dared feel in years, hope. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. The air smelled of sagebrush and dust, the endless prairie stretching before him. Evelyn leaned back slightly, just enough to feel the warmth of Colt's presence at her back, and closed her eyes. For the first time, she let herself imagine what it might mean if the word he had spoken was true.
The town had long memories and short tempers. By the time the morning sun broke over the mesas and threw its pale light across the muddy street of Coldwater, whispers had already run through every shop and saloon. Evelyn, the woman they had declared too sick to even scrub floors, too weak to pull her weight, too close to death to bother with. She now wore the title of wife, and worse, the name attached to that claim was Colt McAllister. He walked beside her that morning, his hat pulled low, boots crunching the gravel as if the eyes drilling into his back meant nothing. Evelyn kept her gaze down, clutching the shawl he had found for her, something plain but warmer than the threadbare dress she'd been abandoned in. She tried to hide the tremor in her steps, but every cough betrayed her. The folks standing outside the mercantile leaned in close, muttering to each other, spitting tobacco into the dust as though she carried a plague. Colt's jaw stayed tight, but inside him stirred a fire he hadn't felt in years. He knew exactly what they saw, a burden, a sick woman who'd collapse before the harvest, someone who would drain him until he too fell into ruin. But he also knew what they didn't see. That night, when her fever had nearly taken her, she had whispered her thanks to him with a softness that cracked something open in his chest. In the half-light of dawn, when her body had shivered beneath his worn blanket, her eyes had carried a fight that no one else in Coldwater bothered to notice. They made it as far as the general store before the first man stepped forward. Jeremiah Hodge, a rancher with arms thick as hickory stumps, blocked their way. "McAllister," he drawled, spitting into the dust, "never figured you for a fool. You tie yourself to a woman who won't see another winter? That's no wife you got there. That's a coffin with legs." The words hung heavy in the street. Evelyn's breath caught, and she pressed closer to Colt, not from affection, but from the raw sting of humiliation. Colt, for his part, didn't flinch. He lifted his head, his blue-gray eyes cutting into Jeremiah with a steadiness that made the bigger man shift his weight. "She's my wife," he said, his voice low but carrying, "and you'd best to remember it." A ripple of murmurs spread among the onlookers. Jeremiah gave a dry chuckle, but he didn't push further. He stepped aside, tipping his hat mockingly. Colt guided Evelyn into the store, the tension in his arm as unyielding as steel. Inside, Evelyn leaned against the counter, catching a breath. Her cheeks burned, not just from sickness, but from shame. "You shouldn't have done this. I'll ruin you. They'll never let you live it down." Colt studied her for a moment, the corners of his mouth tightening. "Evelyn, I've been ruined before. I know the taste of it. A man don't come back from war clean. A man don't wander cattle trails for years without ghosts riding him. Folks in this town, hell, they've been waiting for me to fail since the day I set foot here. So if I'm bound to fall, I'll fall standing next to you." She stared at him, uncertain whether to believe his conviction or call it madness. No one had ever spoken of her as if she were worth standing for. That evening, after the worst of the day's stares, they returned to Colt's small homestead outside town. The cabin was sturdy but simple, a single room with a loft above. The smell of leather and smoke clung to the walls. Evelyn hesitated at the threshold, as if stepping inside made the lie more permanent. Colt noticed her hesitation, but he said nothing. He simply lit the lamp, set his hat on the peg, and began to warm water in the basin. "You can sleep in the bed. I'll take the chair." Evelyn almost laughed, but the sound died in her throat. "You don't have to pretend chivalry. You've already done more than I deserve." Colt paused, turning toward her. "Evelyn, this ain't about pretending. You're my wife now, whether you believe it or not, and I won't have my wife sleeping cold on the floor." The words struck her harder than she expected, not because she believed them, how could she, but because of the way he said them, as if there was no room for doubt. The days that followed tested them both. Evelyn tried to contribute, though her strength failed her often. She swept, cooked simple meals, mended his shirts with trembling fingers. Each effort was met with Colt's quiet nod, never pity, never dismissal. When she faltered with coughing fits, he fetched water without complaint. When she nearly collapsed hanging laundry, he steadied her with hands rough from rope and reins, but gentle as if she were glass. The town, however, was relentless. Women turned their backs on her in church. Men whispered crude jokes in the saloon, betting how long before Colt regretted his rash choice. Children, cruel in their innocence, tossed stones near her feet when she passed, calling her half-dead bride.
Colt bore it in silence, but the weight pressed heavy on him. At night, sitting by the fire, he'd watch Evelyn's frail frame curled beneath the blanket. The cough would rattle her chest, and each time it sounded like thunder in his ears. He had buried brothers who coughed that way after Shiloh. He had seen the sickness eat men alive, until nothing was left but skin stretched thin over bone. He told himself he could handle it, that he had already lived through worse, but the truth was more complicated. Somewhere along the line, Evelyn's survival had become more than defiance against the town. It had become personal, almost desperate. He found himself bargaining in the quiet. If she could last another week, another month, maybe the town would soften. Maybe the world would give her a fair chance. One night, as the storm winds howled outside, Evelyn broke the silence. Her voice was fragile, but steady. "Why, Colt? Why say I'm your wife? You could have walked away like everyone else. No one would have blamed you." He stared into the fire, the glow painting harsh lines across his face. "Because I know what it feels like, to be written off, to be told you ain't worth saving. After the war, folks looked at me the same way, thought I was too broken to work, too haunted to build a life. Maybe they were right, but I swore then if I ever had the chance, I wouldn't turn my back on someone just because the world already had." Her eyes filled with tears, not from weakness, but from something she couldn't name. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt seen, not as a sick woman, not as a burden, but as someone worth standing beside. Still, each day was a battle. The whispers never ceased. The church elders began questioning Colt's place in the congregation, hinting that God did not bless a union made out of desperation. The banker looked at him with narrowed eyes when he came to renew his loan, as though Evelyn's presence somehow made him less trustworthy. Even friends from the cattle trail kept their distance. Evelyn bore it with a quiet dignity, but Colt saw the toll it took. He began to wonder if marrying her, even in name, had saved her only to cage her in cruelty. And yet, on a morning when her strength seemed nearly gone, he watched her step outside with the rising sun. She stood barefoot in the grass, pale and trembling, but her face lifted toward the light, as though she had borrowed strength from it. Colt, standing at the doorway, felt something shift deep within him. He realized that in defending her, he wasn't just saving her from the town. He was saving himself, from the ghosts, from the emptiness, from the endless trail that had always stretched before him. For the first time in years, Colt McAllister wanted something more than survival. He wanted Evelyn to live. He wanted the town to choke on their scorn when they saw her rise. And he swore, with the weight of a man who had already buried too many promises, that he would see it through.
The storm that had been silently swelling over the prairie finally burst into the heart of the town. It wasn't rain or thunder, but the kind of storm that began in human hearts. Whispers, resentment,
and old cruelties braided together into something sharp and unforgiving. For weeks, Evelyn had walked with her chin lifted, her fragile figure wrapped in modest dresses, her frail steps beside Colt like a shadow that refused to be erased. Yet every movement, every glance, every small gesture was weighed, measured, and twisted by the townsfolk. They said she was too sick to work, a burden, a woman who should have disappeared quietly instead of daring to hold a place at a man's side. Some whispered harsher words, painting her presence as sin, a plague that would drain the ranch dry. The kindness that Colt gave her, the roof, the food, the steady protection of his name, was seen as indulgence, weakness. For a man as respected and feared as Colt, it became fuel for resentment. It was a Sunday morning when the first spark flared into open hostility. The church bell had not yet rung when Evelyn stepped out of the house, her pale hands clutching a shawl against the wind. She wanted only to fetch water from the well, but the street was already awake. Women with baskets paused. Men leaning against fence posts narrowed their eyes. One of the older matrons, Mrs. Calloway, let her voice cut sharp through the air. "You don't belong here, girl," she said, loud enough for the others to hear. "Sick bodies bring death into good homes. You should know your place." Evelyn froze, her breath clouding in the chill. The water bucket trembled in her grip, her body fragile against the weight of so many stairs. Before she could answer, a young man laughed cruelly from across the road. "Colt should have saved himself the trouble and married a ghost. At least a ghost doesn't cough in your ear every night." The word struck Evelyn harder than any stone. Her cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin, willing herself not to cry. That was when Colt appeared, striding from the barn with his hat low and his eyes burning like storm clouds. "Say it again." Colt's voice cut through the morning, low and steady. The laughter died at once. He stood tall, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver, though he hadn't drawn it. "Say it again about my wife." No one dared. Silence pressed against the street, broken only by the sound of Evelyn's shallow breathing. She wanted to shrink, to vanish, but Colt's presence was a wall between her and the hatred of the town. Yet she also knew what it cost him. Every defense he made for her only deepened the rift with people he had once called neighbors. That night, the real danger came. A shadow moved near the ranch, torchlight flickering in the dark. Evelyn was in the small room Colt had given her, curled under quilts when she heard it, the crackle of fire, sudden and vicious. Her heart lurched. She stumbled to the window and saw flames licking at the barn's side. Horses screamed, the smell of burning hay thick in the air. "Colt!" she cried, her voice ragged. Colt was already there, rushing into the inferno without hesitation. Evelyn, terrified, grabbed a blanket and tried to beat at the spreading fire, coughing as smoke clawed at her lungs. Figures lingered beyond the fence, men with bandanas over their faces, watching, waiting. She realized then this wasn't an accident. This was a warning, a punishment. Her knees weakened, and for a moment she thought she would collapse, but something inside her refused to yield. She pressed on, choking back the smoke, trying to free a trapped colt tangled in rope. Her frail body trembled, yet her hands worked desperately until the rope fell free. Colt emerged, soot streaked across his face, leading the horses out. He caught sight of her, her shawl singed, her cheeks wet with tears and ash. For the first time since he had called her wife, a crack of fear broke through his steady gaze. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, pulling her back from the blaze. but there was no anger in his grip, only fear of losing her. The barn collapsed before dawn, leaving blackened beams jutting against the horizon like broken bones. The men who had set the fire were gone, but their message lingered in the smoke. Evelyn was not welcome, and Colt's defiance had drawn a line no one would forgive. As the sun rose, the town gathered again, staring at the ruin. Some shook their heads, others muttered prayers, but none offered help. Evelyn stood beside Colt, her hand slipping into his without thought. The gesture was small, but it felt like stepping into a storm without cover. She could feel the stares searing her skin, the unspoken threat hanging heavier than the smoke. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something with startling clarity. She was not just living under Colt's name. She was fighting beside him, even if it meant being swallowed by the same fire.
The night after the fire was not a night at all, but a long, aching stretch of silence, broken only by Evelyn's shallow breathing and the occasional rasp of Colt's boots pacing the cabin floor. The smoke had burned her lungs. Her body was weak, and her skin bore the red marks of heat and falling debris. Yet she lived. Colt had carried her out through the flames, against the crowd's will, and in doing so had crossed the threshold from which there was no return. Outside, the town murmured in hushed tones. Some pitied, some accused, most simply watched, unsure how far this cowboy would go for the woman they had dismissed as a burden. Inside, the world was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more fragile. Evelyn opened her eyes in the early dawn, her voice barely a thread of sound. "You should have left me," she whispered. Colt's hands stilled over the wet cloth he'd been using to cool her forehead. His eyes, weary but unwavering, held hers. "Don't ask me to stand by while a mob decides your worth. You're not theirs to judge." Tears pooled in her smoke-stung eyes. "But I'll ruin you, Colt. You've tied yourself to someone who can barely stand, who, to me, makes me want to stand taller," he cut in, his voice rough but steady. "You don't see it, Evelyn. They called you weak, but I see strength every time you fight to breathe, every time you don't let despair take you under. If I lose everything because of this, so be it. At least I know what I chose." It was not a grand declaration shouted before crowds, but in that dim cabin it was more binding than any vow. Days bled into one another. Colt stayed close, tending the small farm plot, keeping Evelyn fed and brushing away the whispers that crept up the road like weeds. She began to heal in small increments, able to sit by the fire, to sew torn fabric with trembling hands, to laugh softly at Colt's awkward attempts at cooking. Yet for all the quiet progress, the storm outside their door had not passed. The town had not forgiven. One evening, the sheriff himself came, his broad frame casting a shadow across the doorway. He removed his hat, but his words carried no courtesy. "Colt, we've tolerated plenty from you, but this makes you an outcast. You call her your wife, but she's too sick to hold her own. She'll drain you dry. The council wants you to leave before more trouble follows." Colt leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. His tone was calm, but beneath it simmered steel. "I reckon my home ain't theirs to take, Sheriff. Evelyn's not theirs to cast out." The sheriff's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to Evelyn, who stood shakily just behind Colt, pale but unyielding. For the first time she spoke for herself. "I didn't ask for his help, but I won't apologize for living. If you see me as a burden, so be it, but don't you dare use his love as proof against him." The sheriff's brows furrowed. He was not a cruel man, but he was bound by the fears and prejudices of the people he served. He tipped his hat low,
and left, though the unspoken threat lingered. They were alone, the two of them, against the town. Winter pressed in harsh and unrelenting. The land froze, and with it came scarcity. Evelyn felt guilt gnaw at her when she saw Colt return from long days of labor, his hands raw from chopping wood and hauling water, only to find her by the fire, struggling simply to stay upright. One night, as he dropped his axe by the door and slumped into a chair, she sat beside him, hands clasped tightly. "Colt," she said softly, "I can't keep being just your weight. Let me try at least to help with the fields, to work beside you." He shook his head. "Not while you're still coughing blood into your handkerchief." "I can endure it," she pressed. "I'd rather die trying to give than die knowing I only took." Her words cut him deeper than any blade. He turned to her, brushing a strand of loose hair from her face. "You think being here, fighting to live, isn't giving? Evelyn, you've already given me more than you know. You've given me someone to fight for." Still, he saw the fire in her eyes. She was not content to be sheltered forever. Against his worry, he let her join him in small ways, sorting seed, tending chickens, carrying light loads. Each task left her exhausted, yet her smile grew brighter, her laughter stronger. It was as if choosing to share the burden gave her back a piece of herself. The months rolled by. What began as a desperate defiance gradually shaped into a quiet rhythm of survival. And though the town continued to watch with suspicion, something began to shift. Children would come by to trade eggs, curious to see the cowboy's sick wife, and leave with stories of her gentle humor. A few women, tired of the town's cruelty, slipped small parcels of herbs or cloth to Evelyn, whispering, "Don't let them break you." Even suspicion, when stretched too far, frayed into grudging respect. But it was not the town that mattered most. It was what happened between the two of them. One late spring evening, after a day of planting, they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed into the horizon. Evelyn leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it, calling me your wife when the whole town turned against you?" Colt was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, his hand gently lifting her chin until her eyes met his. "Not once, because the truth is, I meant it." Her breath caught. The words settled deep in her chest, heavier and more healing than any blade. She saw then that he hadn't called her wife merely to shield her from shame. He had spoken from something real, something steady. Tears traced down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. She whispered, "Then let me be worthy of it." And for the first time she kissed him, not out of gratitude, not out of desperation, but out of love that had taken root in the most barren of soils. The seasons turned again. Evelyn's health did not vanish into miracle, but it steadied. She would always carry the scars of illness, the weakness in her chest, but she also carried strength, the kind forged in fire and scorn, in tenderness and defiance. When strangers passed through town, they often asked about the couple in the cabin at the edge of the prairie. The answers varied. Some said he had ruined himself for a dying woman. Others said she had bewitched him. But those who looked closer saw something else entirely. They saw a cowboy and his wife, two souls bound not by circumstance, but by a choice made in the face of the world's cruelty. And in the quiet of their home, away from gossip and judgment, Evelyn and Colt knew the truth. What began as a reckless act of defiance had become the very thing that saved them both. For love, once spoken aloud, even against the will of an entire town, has a way of turning exile into sanctuary. And so when the prairie winds howled and the nights grew long, Colt would draw her close and remind her in the simplest words, the ones that had once shocked the crowd and now healed every wound. My wife. And Evelyn, with a smile that no illness could steal, would answer softly, my husband. The world had tried to call her unworthy, too sick, too weak, but in his arms and in her own quiet courage she had found another name, one she could live by.